Good evening, and welcome to Hardfire. I'm Ronald Wieck. Tonight we're bringing you another show devoted to the exploration of 9/11 conspiracy theories. We're going to concentrate on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. World Trade Center 7 is something of a stepchild among these theories because the building was not hit by a plane and it collapsed 7 hours after the attacks. So we have two guests tonight who I think are uniquely qualified to discuss this subject. My first guest is Arthur Scheuerman. Arthur was a member of the New York City Fire Department for 20 years. He retired as a battalion chief. He's written a book on the collapse of the Twin Towers, Fire in the Skyscraper. It's available through .com. He also has a chapter on World Trade Center 7 in the book, and it's lavishly illustrated, well worth your attention. My other guest is probably familiar to you, Mark Roberts, a 9/11 researcher extraordinaire. Mark has published numerous papers on various aspects of the events of 9/11. He has a paper specifically devoted to World Trade Center 7. It's entitled The Lies of the Truth Movement. He shows how quotes are taken out of context and sometimes distorted grotesquely. But he will tell you more about that in the body of the show. I'd like to begin with Arthur. I'm going to read a quote from his paper on World Trade Center 7, and he talks about the establishment of a collapse zone. The anticipation of collapse was a brilliant conclusion, and no lives were lost when the 47-story building collapsed about an hour and a half after the evacuation order was given. The BBC somehow misheard the orders to evacuate the collapse zone and reported the building had collapsed well before it actually did. Now, Arthur, it sounds to me like this is an extraordinary feat by the fire department to avoid any more loss of life on this terrible day.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you abandon a building and it's an uncontrolled fire, there is a possibility of collapse, no matter what kind of building it is, you know, if the fire is bad enough. And the collapse zone was like, how many feet was it?
About 600 feet, just about the height of the building.
600 feet, which included buildings around that, so they had to evacuate other buildings. They had to evacuate everybody out of the street. So it was a big thing just getting everybody evacuated. And but it's standard procedure. If you're abandoning a building that's on fire.
Now that's what I wanted to touch on when you say it's standard procedure. The fire department deals with probabilities rather than certainties. In other words, when they decide that a building is unstable and liable to collapse, they don't know that it's going to collapse. They're just making a professional judgment.
Right, absolutely.
Okay. Now, that's a point that you've touched on a number of times. I remember in our debates with Jim Fetzer, you were also talking about that. How do you construct any sort of conspiracy theory regarding the collapse of World Trade Center 7 that doesn't entail complicity on the part of the fire department?
Yeah, this is something that the conspiracists just don't seem to get, although I've tried to drill it in many times in person. The very first time I faced any of them in person, Les Jameson, the head of New York 9/11 Truth, was claiming that the fire department got this word from above. Well, from above who? And he said, you know, the commissioner must have known, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the bottom line is that the people on the ground, the people who were making those decisions, weren't conferring with anyone else, nor did they take orders from anybody else. And I'm sure Arthur will back me up on that.
Right, the chief in charge of the building is in total charge of that building. He can evacuate it or do anything he wants with it. That's his responsibility.
Yeah, so they've spent a lot of time trying to take quotes out of context. I've spent, in that paper in particular, lots of time putting them back in context and saying, this is what all the people who were there fighting that fire and determining the safety of the building think, and there are no dissenters. No one there from any level said that that was a bad idea to pull people away, so that they didn't think the building was going to collapse. And in fact, there were people like demolition experts who were there who would come down after the towers collapsed, who said, we were absolutely sure the building was going to collapse because of the severity of the fires and the amount of the damage. So they're unanimous in that. No, they didn't know exactly when, but what was the prudent thing to do, to take people away from the building. and thank God they did. Potentially saved a lot of lives by doing that. And guys didn't want to leave the pile either. They didn't want to leave the search for their fallen and buried brothers there. So it took hours to get everybody away from that.
See, I find it extraordinary that anyone could claim foreknowledge, anyone could claim complicity when 343 firefighters lost their lives. I mean, it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, if they were warned by somebody to get away from Building 7 for some reason, and it wasn't the fire department's decision, why weren't they warned about the towers if the towers were supposedly blown up? And they lost a good deal of their leadership, the FDNY's leadership. The Chief Gansey died there, Deputy Commissioner Feehan died there, Chief Downey's safety chief died there. They lost hundreds of years worth of fire department leadership, and yet the same people are warned that Building 7 is going to come down? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Before we let Arthur describe the structure of World Trade Center 7, I want to lay to rest a canard that's been floating around for years, and every time you think that it's dead, it resurfaces. You used the magic word pull. Now, Larry Silverstein said to a fire chief, in view of the tremendous loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do would be to pull it. Rational people understand him. He meant, let's get these men out of harm's way. They're in a dangerous environment, an unstable building. Let's pull the contingent out.
I think the chief probably told Silverstein, we want to pull our men out.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't asking for permission.
Anybody in there, you have any reason why we shouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly wouldn't be asking the owner of the building for permission to pull them out.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, now, this phrase, pull it, conspiracy theorists keep saying that it means blow up the building and that it's industry slang. But it's not.
No.
I mean, I have personally called 20 demolition companies. They all agree that pull it does not mean blow up the building. There is a specific use for the term involving cables, attaching cables to a small structure and literally pulling it off its center of gravity. But it's time to put this one to bed. If you have Silverstein saying there's been a tremendous loss of life, the smartest thing to do would be blow up the building, he's not making any sense, and he's making this request to a firefighter.
Nor would he know demolition terminology. There's nothing about and plus the fact that he's supposedly saying this to a national audience on television. Hey, here's my billion-dollar crime that I'm going to tell you about. His insurance company didn't have a problem with that statement. They paid $861 million on the WTC7 claim.
Well, he's Lucky Larry. Now, he did lose a lot of money, so how lucky is that?
If he were confessing to this crime, you'd think that the insurance company, they're not exactly known for paying out real easily, would have said, maybe we shouldn't pay that $861 million until we look into this a bit farther. But no, it's just, the whole thing is absurd. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Arthur, you have described the nuts and bolts of the collapse of the building. Start off by telling us if, in your opinion, this building met standards, safety standards that have been approved for skyscrapers. Do you think this was a safe building?
No, I don't think it was, because number one, the span of the beams was like 53 feet. Mm-hmm. When they test a floor assembly, they test 17 foot maximum. So there's no way that they could know that something that was probably twice the span would be safe under fire conditions, because they only test them at 17 feet. That's the standard.
Now, why was it approved? I mean, why were they able to?
Well,
it was the standard.
The Port Authority has say over what they build. They're not responsible for any codes, and they developed the codes for this building when they were building the towers. So there's a lot of similarities in the buildings. The core had no lateral support, which is normal to have diagonals in the core. So all the core columns, if they were pushed out of alignment too far, they would collapse. The spans, I say, were too long. There were a lot of other things that I could mention, like the stairways were probably enclosed in sheetrock instead of hardened to protect it against any damage. there was a lot of deficiencies.
Now, you make an interesting point in your paper. We understand that Building 7 was impacted by large pieces of debris from the North Tower that created a 10-story gash in the south side. You made the point that the fires alone could have brought about the collapse of Building 7. So in other words, you think that the debris itself was perhaps not the main problem here?
Well, that's my opinion from studying it. And I mean, they have to do further tests on this. They have to do computer analyses, and they have to even maybe do some long span floor testing, you know, some actual 60-foot long span floors.
But that's what NIST. We should point out that there is going to be an official report that they're working on now and have been working on for a few years.
Due in the summer.
National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They had an interim report in June of 2004, but have learned a lot since then. And they don't even have in a couple of months they'll have their final hypothesis out. So when we're talking about what did happen to the building according to them, we're not quite sure yet what their final version is going to be. But they're saying that they're not really including the damage to the building as a main cause of collapse. They're just considering the fires, and they're just considering, which is fairly new information, they're just considering that it was not fed by the diesel oil, pressurized oil lines that were in the building, which is something that everyone had talked about quite a bit, that could have been a cause of why the fires were so severe. But they're saying that, well, the fires were basically normal office fires. And going under that assumption, the building still could have and did collapse.
Now, that's pretty much what you're saying.
Well, they also did some preliminary studies, and they found that if one column on the long span side of this building went out, the entire set of floors up to the roof would collapse. And that is definitely not according to city code, because the city code states that if one column is removed, the other columns have to take up the load. And I think it was the floors that sagged and pulled the column out of alignment.
Now, you described the penthouse. The east penthouse caves in and pulls the west penthouse along with it, creating that distinctive kink that we see in the photo.
It wasn't the east penthouse that pulled it. It was all the floors.
Well, I mean, the floors are pulling.
That happened from the bottom, near the bottom.
Okay.
Anyway, so it didn't. People see the first real visible sign of the collapse is the east penthouse, and we're talking about a huge structure, mechanical penthouse. This isn't where Larry Silverstein lived, as I've seen conspiracists say.
Yes.
Huge structure, the size of several apartment buildings on my block. And you see that descend into the roof line first. But what was happening is down below. The floors had given way, columns had lost their support and collapsed. So you can see this sort of rippling effect going up the building.
Now, you said it's started like on the 5th floor?
It could have started on the 12th floor or the 8th floor. I don't know which, but when all the floors lost the support of that column, or those columns, they're still attached together, the floors. Now, if they go down, they're pulling on the outside walls and the core columns, because they go into suspension. It's just like a cable in suspension. So pulling on the core columns, and that's what collapsed the core columns. And then you saw the west roof go in, the west penthouse go in, because the entire core failed. Once the core failed, everything goes down. The last thing to fall was the outside frame, which was probably pretty strong because it came down as a unit. It was collapsed by the time the outside frame
That's a good point. One of the things that the conspiracists say is a sign of a controlled demolition is that the building fell pretty much straight down. I think we all agree that it did fall pretty straight down.
I was just going to ask you about that. I mean, it was all over Barclay Street, and it did heavy damage to 30 Washington.
A lot of that, yeah, it wasn't a neat pile, certainly. I mean, it destroyed a building that's being torn down right now, 30 West Broadway. But the start of the collapse, yes, it's pretty much vertical. But what's happening is the collapse starts in the interior, center interior of the building. It's a huge building. It's almost 100 meters on the north side, 186 feet in depth. And And when you have a failure in the center of that, how else is the building going to collapse? People are saying that, oh, it should have been, because there was damage on the south side from the collapse of the North Tower, that it should have toppled over that way. Well, no. If the columns are all still in good shape, most of the columns are in good shape, the core columns are still in good shape, then it's not going to topple over. But if the failure happens where the core columns are, it's going to fall straight down.
Doesn't it irritate you to continue to read in 2008 that there were no significant fires and hardly any damage to the facade of the building? I mean, why would you be satisfied with that explanation when it's demonstrably untrue?
Right, there was a very serious fire on the 12th floor, I believe, and it covered practically half the building.
Yeah, you have photos.
Yeah, I mean, you can see fire out 8 windows on one side, on the east side of the building, and there was fire showing on the north side, out a couple of windows.
Now, when the fire department decides that the fire is too severe to warrant risking men's lives, what are we talking about? I mean, how bad a fire is that when they say, we don't think we can handle this, we're just going to pull our men out? Would
Well,
that
they had a problem with water supply. If you don't have water, you can't put the fire out.
They didn't have pressure, didn't have water pressure.
Didn't have water pressure, so there was it was a fait accompli. They couldn't do anything.
So you have a building
had
that's
to pull
heavily damaged by debris, that has extremely severe fires raging, and you have no water to fight the fires, and people are wondering, why did this building fall down?
There's a really good comparison that conspiracists need to look into, and I cover this in my paper a little bit, which is between Building 7 and 90 West Street, which is just on the opposite side of the World Trade Center site. Was also hit by quite a bit of debris, had very severe fires in it, and burned for parts of 2 days. Now, why didn't that building collapse? Well, that building, a beautiful office building designed by Cass Gilbert, great architect, was built in 1907, I believe. Old style construction. Columns are close together, short span beams, but most importantly, the fireproofing that was attached to all that steel. Steel has to be fireproofed, or it's going to fail eventually in a fire, no matter how thick it is. Very thick cement and terracotta fireproofing. That's how they built them in those days. Expensive to build, takes up a lot of room. You don't have a lot of office space when you build like that. But very little structural damage to that building from the very severe fires that happened. So compare that to the spray-on fireproofing that was in Building 7. That doesn't take a blow very well. And you can see in some of the other buildings that didn't collapse, that were hit by debris, fireproofing is knocked right off of those beams. I was in Building 7 when they were constructing it, and I went to check to see how the fireproofing was. It's better than it used to be, because they're using fireproofing that's 5 times more durable than it's required by code. But the code, as Arthur I think will say in 1968 or so, did not require very substantial or very durable fireproofing.
Oh, Arthur, I think you're corroborating in your paper what Mark is saying. You talk about the great floor space in this building.
Yeah.
Is this a trade-off? More floor space, less safety?
Absolutely, because number one, they take the columns out because they want free floor space for the office workers. And they want views out the window for everybody in the office. So they take the walls out, the firewalls out. So in the old buildings, they had a limit to the size of an area that was enclosed by firewalls. In these buildings, they were some of the floors were completely open. So a fire could start on one end and travel all the way around the floor.
Now, we have to talk about controlled demolition, because this is, after all, the reason for these conspiracy theories. If no one blew up the building, then what are we talking about? Wouldn't the fire department, having watched a building come down, inquire if it might have been blown up? I mean, wouldn't they look for some evidence of a...
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it again defies belief that people will accuse the fire department of neglecting to check for explosives.
Also, if you use explosives, there's characteristic tears in the steel. you can tell right away if explosives have been used, you know.
I'm glad you raised this point. When you say you can tell right away, in other words, experienced firefighters aren't scratching their heads saying, gee, I wonder if this could have been a demolition. I mean, they're looking for something specific, and they're not finding it at World Trade Center 7.
Well, and the other things that anyone can tell that didn't happen were a huge detonation, which you have to have in an explosion. I've got a video online called WTC Not a Demolition that compares actual demolitions and what they sound and look like to what the World Trade Center buildings sounded and looked like. In none of the buildings was there anything remotely like these enormous charges, even from a small amount of demolition charges. And in these buildings, you need a fairly substantial amount because these are very heavy columns.
47-story building, yeah.
Even if you only wanted to take a few columns out, they're huge columns, and you don't have a chance to prepare them ahead of time like a demolitions team would. Enormous blasts, unmistakable, louder, much louder than the collapses would be. Windows would be blown out. The smoke that's coming out of these open windows would be pushed out. You'd see that ejected. None of that happened.
Well, they keep talking about the squibs now.
It's an issue that even Richard Gage, as bad as he is of architects and engineers for 9/11 truth, as completely incompetent as he is, has actually dropped. He said that people were saying that at the very top of the building, in some of the videos, you can see some ejections of dust that come out. Well, that was open. It had been hit by debris. It was open to the air. Smoke was pouring out. And why would you put demolition charges at the very top of the building anyway? It makes no sense at all.
And the fact that they were going upward means to me that the floors were pulling out in that corner.
Oh, sure.
From the bottom up.
Yeah. So even he has dropped that claim. So hopefully we won't hear much more about that.
Can you think of some particularly egregious examples of members of the truth movement distorting the words of firefighters on the scene?
Oh, sure. Richard Gage, again, on his website, it says that one of the signs of controlled demolition is foreknowledge. Well, of course, if you're going to blow up a building, people have to know about that. But they're applying that to the World Trade Center buildings and to Building 7. So his idea is that since the fire department says that they felt the building was going to come down, that's a sign of controlled demolition, completely ignoring the fact that many people there actually took a look at the building, were inside the building, outside the building. It was groaning, it's creaking, it's got these enormous uncontrollable fires in it, and made that determination. And to him, oh no, that's actually a sign of controlled demolition.
Yeah, in other words, a professional judgment.
You can't possibly twist someone's observation, determination, and words more than that. You can't be more wrong than that. And it's unbelievably reprehensible that someone, and a professional too, in the building trades, would do that. Unbelievable.
Now would be a good time to point out that, you know, here we are talking among ourselves. We did invite representatives of the truth movement. Nobody wants to face a real retired battalion chief. Nobody wants to face Mark Roberts. We would like to have an opponent for these gentlemen, but we couldn't find one.
There are a few people who would do it, some of the no-planers and things like that, but they don't have a constituency as far as I can see. Yeah. They're very vocal, but I have a policy of not engaging with them.
Yeah, I think it would be appropriate for someone who's trying to sell a book or a DVD to have the good taste to defend his position in an open debate.
They seem to think that these questions that we ask are too hard of them. Well,
or unfair.
If they're unfair. If they're claiming, if they're going to make these incredible claims, they ought to have something to back it up with. And I don't think that we ask anything that's unreasonable.
Arthur, as a retired firefighter, have you had any personal dealings with people from the truth movement, people who...
No, except on the internet.
Yeah.
I read some of them, but...
But do you get accused
of complicity? I went to one of Gage's lectures, and it was practically everything he said was questionable. You know, it was like I had my hand up the entire time, and he didn't want to even look at me. You know?
Yeah, it seems funny though that here you are promoting a great truth that you claim is being suppressed, and you don't take the opportunity to advance your cause.
I think the big problem is that they don't have any hypothesis that they're trying to advance. It's just anomalies here that they perceive here and there. And when we ask them, how does this fit in, like we would, how does this Building 7 fit in to any any conspiracy theory that you have.
That's the problem. There's simply no
they can't
way
do
to
it.
fit this square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
I mean, where does Larry Silverstein suddenly enter the picture? Here he is barging in, this impossibly vast conspiracy. He's trying to conquer the world for Halliburton, and now Larry Silverstein is running an insurance scam.
And the fire department's in on it with him.
Somehow the fire department's in on this. It's I don't know, Arthur. Did you know any of the heroes who lost their lives? Did you?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So this is rather a personal discussion as far as you're concerned.
Yeah,
this is
right.
not something that you can make light of,
Yeah, exactly.
But also in fighting for building safety. Skyscrapers need to be safer. And Arthur's book
That's
points that out.
my main point of the book is to upgrade the codes.
You're looking forward to the
Because
NIST.
we had good codes in 1938. In 78, they changed the codes. They lowered all the standards. All the 4-hour wall became a 3-hour wall.
Why was that done?
Well, the
Real
real
estate.
estate industry somehow got control of the codes and changed them. It's very easy. You go to the powers that be in the city and look, we'd like to change this. Here's some money.
They want
and
more
you gotta
rentable
change.
office space.
So World Trade Center 7 is going to be rebuilt. It's going to be,
Well, has been rebuilt.
I mean, is it going to be safer?
It ought to be.
burn
It's got
anything.
a concrete core.
Yeah, it is
It doesn't
safer
have
now.
this wallboard core. that the other buildings have.
Christopher will be delighted.
Exactly, and much better fireproofing, much better life and safety systems, wider stairwells for people to get out and firefighters to get in. All of the firefighting systems inside are protected inside that concrete core.
But still, the Port Authority is not required to follow the codes. I mean,
They
did it on their own.
They agree to, yeah, but they're not
They
required
agree to, but
they're not
they're
required
actually
to.
not.
So it'll be
So
interesting.
the code is simply a guideline then. It's not, has no binding
For the
force.
Port Authority, which is a really sort of strange organization, that what they're allowed to do and what they're not. Now, the new buildings that are going to be there are going to have a lot of these same life safety systems and all, but again, they're not required, still not required to abide by the codes. They've agreed to, but they're not required to.
Well, again, we've come to the end of another Hardfire discussion. I thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank my two guests, Arthur Scheuerman,
Thank you.
Mark Roberts. It's been a pleasure having both of you gentlemen. We look forward to seeing you again on another edition of Hardfire. Thank you. I'm Ronald Wieck. Good night.
Hardfire is funded in part by the Libertarian Party of New York. www.ny.lp.org. Catering for the cast and crew of Hardfire is generously provided by Da Vincenzo Restaurant, 256 Prospect Park West, Brooklyn, New York, 11215, 718-369-3590, www.davincenzorestaurant.com.